Welcome back. In this video I'm going to take you through all the different procedural texture nodes in Blender. Okay, so you may be wondering why we're still in the shader example file. Well, this is actually the node explanation example file, and shader examples is just one of the scene layers in it. If you go to the top right hand corner and click on this drop down box, you can see I have another scene set up within this file called procedural textures. And when we click on that, we get something slightly different. We get a new scene. So this scene has a camera in it. I'll just turn on overlays so you can see that camera. And we also have something strange going on here, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Let me hit 0 to go through my camera view. And we'll just zoom out a little bit. And we'll go into Cycles Render Mode. So at the moment, we're just looking directly down on a plane. And now we can look at these different texture nodes. So you'll find your texture nodes within the Add menu under Texture, and there are quite a few there. Some of them we're going to very briefly discuss. Some of them we're going to skip over entirely. These top two just open a file browser to bring in images and image sequences, and they come in as an image and video file, which we've already looked at. The particles node is really only useful when you're working with particles, which we are not. So again, we're going to skip over that one. Other ones that we're going to skip over, the magic texture, we've looked at that. It's not super useful unless you want just a crazy psychedelic effect for some reason. The checker texture is really basic, just creates a checker map. There are uses for it, but they're pretty limited. The white noise texture gives a random value between 0 and 1 to each texture space. At the moment, we only have one texture space. Later on in the course, when we start looking at manipulating vector coordinates and building in our own UV mapping, that's going to start coming in a little bit more useful. The same with gradient textures. At the moment, we can just essentially really create a linear gradient from one side of our UV to the other. We can do it quadratic instead of linear, so the fall off is slightly different. Easing diagonal spherical is an interesting one. You get a quarter circle. Quadratic sphere, again, just a different fall off on that gradient, and radial, which you can kind of barely see on this. These textures, they take a little bit of vector manipulation to really get the most out of. We have a few nodes where there's a little bit more to explain. The brick texture is pretty straightforward. We have two colors that are controlled by a bias. So this determines how much of each color you have. We have the mortar color. We have the mortar size, so we can change the space between these bricks. We can take it all the way down and have no mortar at all. If we do have mortar, we have mortar smoothing, which kind of increases the brick in a linear fashion, so we actually get a 45-degree angle on the edges of all our bricks. We can change the height and the brick width. So at the moment it's set to 0.5 wide and 0.25 high. Generally, I would maybe put this to something like 0.6 and 0.2, and that way you get those wider bricks. And I think this looks a little bit more natural as a brick wall. That's totally adjustable. You can adjust it to any values you want, really. Jumping back to the top, offset and frequency 2. So we have an offset of 0.5 and a frequency of 2. That means every second row, we are going to get an offset of 0.5. So with the offset at 0, all our bricks line up. With an offset of 1, all our bricks line up as well. Take that to 0.5. If we change our frequency to 3 or 4 or 5, you see that our offset row gets moved one level. So squash allows us to get a line or a row of bricks that are headers. So if I take squash to 0.5, it will take every second row and make the bricks half as wide. You might think, what's the use of that? That's not very interesting. Well, it does actually give us quite an interesting pattern. But if we take this frequency up to something like 4 or 6, maybe you can start to see how we're actually getting something that's actually more realistic, because generally a lot of brick walls will have a row of headers every now and again to keep the front face of the brick and the back face of the brick kind of join together and makes the wall stronger. What you don't want to have is you don't want to have an odd value in here, because then you start getting your mortar lining up with your header bricks, and that's not realistic at all. You always want to keep an even value in there. So that is our brick texture. It has some drawbacks. We're going to create a node later on that's going to improve that. Wave texture is another quite interesting one. We have bands and we have rings. Depending on the setting you're on, some of these different settings will do different things. We can change the orientation of these. When we're on band, Z gives us nothing. If we're on rings, you can change the rotation, but Z gives us this, which can be really useful for a number of different things. We also have spherical, kind of useful as well. We change back to bands, because we can pretty much show everything off in bands. We can increase and decrease the scale. We can distort these bands. We can add detail to these bands so they get a little bit more granular. We can change the scale of that detail. We can change the roughness of that detail. So we can get quite a few nice effects, and we can move the wave. So this is just a sine wave. Now I've skipped over the type of wave profile. Sine is your basic sine wave. So let me draw this out for you using annotations. So this is your sine wave. Just smooth at the top and the bottom. We also have saw. So the way saw works is we get kind of straight up and down, and then a linear, straight up and down, then a linear, straight up and down, then a linear. And that's the way saw works. And triangle is, you've probably guessed it, it's just a straight up zigzag. Values of 0 along the bottom, values of 1 along the top. Let me just undo these annotations. So maybe you can start to see some potential for the wave texture. If we change back to rings and we change to saw and we change to Z and increase that scale quite a bit, potentially you can see where we might use this for certain textures. I'm just going to leave that out there as a little hint for you. Let's move on to our mathematical functions. We have noise texture, which is just your classic cloudy noise. We can change the scale to make it bigger or smaller. We can add more detail to it or take detail out to make it smoother. Same with roughness. Now you can see that with roughness, we don't really get an effect unless we have detail turned on. So if we put our detail all the way up and our roughness all the way down, we don't really have much happening. Detail all the way down, detail all the way up, we don't have anything happening. We have to have at least some detail before roughness will start kicking in. And at the same time, we have to have some roughness before detail will start kicking in. They go hand in hand. Distortion just starts kind of swirling around your texture. In this case, it's getting as a kind of swirly, smoky type texture that you might be able to use as a map. Musgrave texture is an interesting one. We have, again, a few different settings here. We have multifractal, rigid multifractal, hybrid multifractal, FBM, and heteroterrain. I find Musgrave quite good for creating grunge maps. By grunge, I mean just like random noise, lots of blotches, lots of contrast, dark, dirty looking noise maps. So let's just take this scale up a little bit. Let's adjust the detail, make it really detailed. Adjust this dimension down a little bit. And there we go. We've got a dirt map straight away. We can tweak this linearity setting, which I'm not really sure what it does, but it seems to mess around with the scale. Sometimes we get nice effects and sometimes we don't. With the Musgrave texture, I find it kind of hard to figure out what the documentation means. So when we go to the documentation for the Musgrave texture node, it gives us a lot of information. It tells us what all these different settings actually do. It tells you all about the types. It gives you a whole bunch of examples. And here in the Blender manual, you can see some nice renders of a few different variations. Yeah, I would just experiment with that Musgrave texture because you can create some really cool stuff. So again, nice grungy noise map. Let's go into rigid multifractal. This is a really weird one. If I tweak the gain, I can create these kind of really creepy, weird effects. I can change the offset and start creating some really weird stuff. Changing the dimension, increasing and decreasing the detail. Yeah, there's just, you can get so many weird patterns with the Musgrave texture. It's one of those ones, I mean, I just changed one setting there and immediately I've got something that looks totally different. It looks super weird. I can tweak some settings a little bit, and there I've got my basis for marble or one of these like fancy composite floors or composite worktops. Musgrave is one of those ones where you play with it until you find something you like. You take a screenshot of the node as it is. You take a screenshot of the result and you save it in a folder or a Word file, and if you need that texture at some point in the future, instead of spending half an hour trying to figure out how you created it, you just have the details of that node there. Let's look at Voronoi, and unfortunately, just like Musgrave texture, Voronoi is another one that has just so much potential for different things. So again, let's just very quickly dive into the Blender manual. And I'll just show you these examples. I won't even go through the node myself. The Blender manual does a much better job of explaining what everything does than I could ever do. It has all these different examples for all these different textures you can bring out of it. And right down at the bottom, you can also see that we actually have an example on how to create these rounded paving stones, or it could be the start of a nice sci-fi texture. We have something like this as well, where we can flatten out some metal. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with the Voronoi, and the Musgrave and Voronoi are just ones you can just get lost in for ages. So that takes care of all the procedural texture nodes that we would use for creating materials. There are a couple of other things I want to show you. Let me just go back into our world space. So we're in our world space, and here you can see that we have something kind of weird going on here. So what I have here is I have a cube with a volume in it. I have a plane and I have a light. So let's go to the outliner and click on that spotlight. And you can see that I actually have the light set up to use nodes. So you can see that within our light options, we have an option for nodes. By default, this is set to just a single button that says use nodes. And when you click on it and go into the shader editor, you essentially get these two nodes, an emission and a light output. So you just control your strength and your color, and that creates your light. I've added in an additional node called an IES node. Again, you can find that within textures. And what you do with the IES node is you can download these specific files, .ies files, and you can plug them in and you can give your lights specific characteristics so they look like real world lights. So here is an example of an IES library. This is a website where all these IES files, and there are literally thousands of these IES files on this website, they all give you different patterns for real world lights. They're all completely open source, copyright free, no rights required. You can use them on any project you want. You can download them from this website absolutely free. The file sizes are tiny. They're like 1, 2, 3 kilobyte files. They don't take up any space. They make your lights look much more realistic. We can do a couple of tweaks to these IES textures as well. Now at the moment we're in a spotlight, and if I go to light settings, I have access to things like the spotlight size, so I can increase and decrease that. You can see my rendering is getting really slow here because of the volume. We can also add in our vector nodes, and we can do a very similar thing with this, but one thing to keep in mind, you have to be using normal as your vector. If you use any other setting, it's not going to work. If you change the location of Z, it gives the same effect of changing your spotlight size. So if we change that, you can make it smaller or bigger. Now, you don't really need to know that because you have this set up to spotlight, but if this was set up to a point light, this would actually be the only way of changing that spotlight size. Okay, so that is IES textures. The other thing I want to show you, and this is going to be the last thing for this video, is if we change from object to world shader type, we have two more texture nodes to talk about. We have environment texture and we have sky texture. So at the moment we have an environment in this scene. It's this HDRI, but it's set up through this setting here. If I go to scene world, you can see that we lose that and we have no background. If I plug this color into our background node, you can see that we're waiting for an image. I'm just going to grab this HDRI that I've already imported in that we saw earlier, and now we have our HDRI in our scene. So this is it. This is how you would add an HDRI to your entire world instead of relying on turning off scene world and using these defaults. We could also add in the sky texture node. So again, this is another default thing in Blender. Let me just get rid of this cube for the moment. Let me just hide that. So this is essentially just a big gradient around your world with a light sun disk. And we have a bunch of different settings. We can change the sun size. We can change the sun intensity. We can change the sun elevation. We can change the altitude, which is really interesting because if we go up really high, we start to get that blue sky. You can see the sun there. We can increase that intensity. Everything's going to light up. If we take it down, it essentially goes black. So you definitely want that up. You can raise the elevation. You can rotate the sun around your scene. You can add more air. You can add more dust. You can add more ozone. And with all these settings in tandem, you can actually get a pretty nice, very quick sky texture. So if you're not worried about using an HDRI image and you just want a blue sky in your scene, this is what you would use. Just use that sky texture. Don't worry about HDRIs. Just stick with that. Okay, challenge time. So your challenge for this video is to experiment with the settings in some of the procedural texture nodes. I would definitely concentrate on Voronoi and Musgrave just because there are so many variations of these two textures. Have a look through the Blender manual for more in-depth explanations of the settings for both of these nodes and any of the other nodes that you're interested in. Now, if you come across any effect that you particularly like, take a note of those settings or take a screenshot of the nodes themselves, and also create a render or a screenshot of the result. And if you keep those in a folder somewhere, you'll always have access to those settings and be able to recreate that texture anytime you need it. Now, unfortunately, it's not really suitable to mark these kind of textures or these interesting settings as assets because they're all within the same shader. So if you do mark it as an asset and then you change it, it's going to change that asset. Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking through Blender's other nodes. I'll see you then.